Good morning, friends. Today we come to the final commandment, number 10 of the 10 commandments, which I hope by now you'll never forget from sheer repetition, is found in Exodus chapter 20, in this case verse 17. Let's read it now. Moses records the words of God commanding, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." Like the rest of the commandments, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with this prohibition against coveting. But since the word covet isn't a word we use that often in our daily vocabulary, let's make sure we understand it as best we can. At the basic level, this word covet means to desire, to lust after, or to consider precious. If you'll permit me to geek out for a minute, Gollum from The Lord of the Rings coveted the One Ring. He was obsessed with it, both getting it and keeping it, even to the point where it ruled his every thought and eventually became the source of his own doom. And while that is obviously a fictional story, it is a rather good example of extreme covetousness. And while the way we are tempted to covet may not be as obvious or flagrant as Gollum's experience with the One Ring, covetousness is nevertheless a very real and quite insidious temptation that we're all forced to deal with, and if left unchecked, will lead to a very similar doom. Because God, in short, tells us that we must not covet anything that belongs to our neighbor, not his family, not his possessions, not his abilities, or his reputation. And so the sin of coveting is directly applied to desiring, lusting after, or considering precious something that you don't have, but you see that another person does. And there are two very important aspects of this. The first is the fact that coveting is a sin of the internal person. We've already been told that you can't murder and you can't steal, but the sin of covetousness deals with a sin inside that might lead a person to steal or to murder such that they can get for themselves that thing that the other person has. It is an internal sin that will naturally lead to external action. But it's still a sin, it still breaks God's law, even as it exists internally within us before it even comes out into the external actions. And our response to that sin may not be as extreme as outright theft or murder, but it does come out very naturally in attitudes of bitterness, resentment, anger and spite, or the verbal tearing down of the person who holds that thing which we desire so much. And so whereas Jesus had to clarify that yes, murder and stealing were indeed matters of the heart, we have here right from the get-go in Exodus 20, the very clear instructions in this 10th commandment that sins can be sins even within the confines of the inner person. Because it is in that inner person, the heart and mind, where sin finds fertile ground to take root. The second important thing concerning this sin of coveting is that the only time that it can find that fertile ground to take root is when we are unsatisfied with what we already have. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, as the saying goes, but the reason the grass is always greener is because we're always so tempted to think that what we already have isn't good enough, that constant sense of gnawing dissatisfaction. But of course, that begs the question, especially for Christians, why would we be dissatisfied with what God has provided for us? One of the names God has given is Jehovah Jireh, God my provider. He provides all that we need and more. And that's a literal truth. He provides everything. Now, yeah, maybe your neighbor, and it's easy enough to take this example quite literally, maybe your neighbor next door has a nicer car than you. A significantly larger lawn and better flower gardens, more skill and a greater reputation in the community. But we have to ask ourselves, is that why we're living this life? To please ourselves with the trappings of this world and gain the affection of other people? Or is it to please God and to take great pleasure in the glory of His affection? And here's the thing, just a moment ago I said especially for Christians, but the truth is that this command isn't reserved just for Christians. We were created as a species, as the human race, for the sake of God's glory and to seek His affection. And covetousness, in addition to filling our hearts with nothing but the poison of discontentment and bitterness, goes so much further, such that it shakes its fist in the face of God as if to say, what you've given me just isn't good enough. And it's one of the reasons that the world, apart from Christ, stands condemned. Friends, the significance of God's commandments does not slacken at the end of the list. This command against coveting is just as important and is actually directly linked with the first commandment, to have no other gods before God himself. Because when we covet, we turn the objects of our covetous desire into false gods that then take the place in our hearts and minds of the one true God. So brothers and sisters, beware this subtle sin, this pervasive predisposition toward dissatisfaction and seeing what another person has, whatever it might be, and coveting it. Because when we do that, it will infect our hearts with idolatry. Instead, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, and know that he alone is God. Have a good and godly day, and if the Lord wills, I'll see you tomorrow.